welcome anyways. And it is worthy to note that this is Hispanic Heritage Month. And so it's very appropriate that we're having this program tonight about the indigenous people in Chile. And just to let everybody know, because we have a lot of visitors with us tonight. I think there's a lot of students and faculty and others from Geneseo College that are joining us tonight for the first time, and a special warm welcome to all of you. And please visit our website at ROCLA.org for membership information, because we'd love to have you join us. And I also like to let you know that we're always looking for steering committee members to help us plan programs like this and actions and help with other things. So anybody interested in that, you can either send a chat to me or just let me know. Couple words about the Rochester Committee on Latin America, or ROCLA as we're called, is it's actually about 48 years ago this month that we actually formed. We formed in reaction to Pinochet in Chile coming to power with a coup in 1973 that was really backed by the US government. And so since then, our policy has been to try to educate people about the US foreign policy in Central and South America and the Hispanic countries. And so unfortunately, it seems that our government is still involved with the same type of foreign policies as they were so many years ago. Our steering committee just had an audience with our Congressman Joe Morelli just recently, where we reminded him of the failed US policies and how it's not been working in any of the countries that we say we're going to bring democracy to. And about the same thing is going on now in Nicaragua as well. And that's what we called him particularly about. But it just seems that we're having a hard time learning the lesson. So another thing to note is we are just starting our membership drive, which will be starting this month and next month. So it'd be a great time to get you, everybody that's interested, to join us. And again, the information is on our website. And what else do I want to say? You can follow us on Facebook as well, and Twitter, I think. And I'm wondering if anybody has any other announcements or actions that we should be aware of. Please unmute yourself, but please be brief. Anybody have anything? Okay, that's unusual.
Yes.
Terry, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I thought I would announce the next Lask Coffee House in Buffalo, which will be available on Zoom. And our speaker is was one of the Shell River 7 that were arrested because they sat and chained themselves at the Line 3 pipeline, which is being constructed in Minnesota. So our speaker, Kelly Miracle, is indigenous Seneca Mohawk. And we're going to talk about how that ties in with water protection throughout the hemisphere, including in Honduras in the case of Berta Caceres. So I think the date is the fourth Monday in October, but I don't remember when the fourth Monday in October is. So
okay, thank you, Terry. And I did mean to mention that since COVID, we have been able to take advantage of Zoom by collaborating with the Latin America Solidarity Committee up in Buffalo, New York. And Terry's the convener for that. And my name, by the way, is Tom Ward. I'm the convener in Rochester for ROCLA. And so it's been interesting to be able to have that joint effort together to bring these kind of programs to you. Thank you, Terry. Are there any other announcements? If so, I can't see everybody all the time, and a lot of people aren't on camera. So just unmute yourself and let us know what what we need to know about. I wish, I don't see Marilyn Anderson with us tonight, but they have currently in Rochester, we have the Labor Film Forum Festival going on. So go on the website and find out more about the Rochester Labor Film Festival. It's very interesting. Speaking about that, I'm also happy to announce that I just got an email from Rural and Migrant Ministries about the first union for farm workers in New York State. It's finally been certified, and that's a step in the right direction. So now they'll be subject to collective bargaining and things like that. So good work out there. Another note.
I'm sorry.
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, hi, I'm MJ Curry. I haven't been able to come to meetings for many, many years, but I'm really happy to be here. I'm a professor at the U of R in the Warner School, but I also am on the mailing list for the Humanities Center. And the U of R Humanities Center this year is having a theme of migration. And so they're having a lot of scholars. I don't have a schedule handy, but if you go to the U of R website and Google Humanities Center, I'm sure you will be able to find the events that they're having, lectures and seminars and stuff like that.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, MJ. Good to have you back with us. I also wanted to just pass along some more good news, because we need some good news these days. Back in November, we had Karen Spring, who is an activist living and working in Honduras. And her husband, Edwin Espinal, had been imprisoned in a military prison for almost 2 years on unfounded charges, really phony charges. Well, he went to trial finally 2 weeks ago, and the prosecution was just totally inept. They had no evidence. They had no substantial grounds. And so Edwin and some of the people that were with him when they were arrested were freed. So we're thankful for that. Any other announcements? Okay, I'm going to ask our latest and newest steering committee member, who is Professor Wesley Acosta Damaris, to please introduce our speaker tonight. And Wesley made this all possible and arranged this for us. And so thank you for that, Wesley.
Okay, well, thank you all for the opportunity, and thank you, Gabrielle, for accepting our invitation to come and to share. I'm absolutely sure lots of interesting and relevant information for us and our students as well, and our colleagues who are here. Gabriel Alvarado is a linguist, a lexicographer, translator, and educator based in Santiago, Chile. He's a doctor in Latino, Latin American, and Iberian cultures from the City University of New York. He's a master in Hispanic linguistics from the University of Chile, and a master in Hispanic lexicography from the Asociación de Academias de Lenguas Españolas, ASALE. Is that right, Gabriel?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, all right. He has also been a Spanish language and Hispanic linguistics instructor in Chile, Egypt, and the United States. And between 2006 and 2014, he worked in several Spanish language dictionaries at the Chilean Academy of Language, and again, ASALE, the Asociación de Academias de la Lengua Española. His doctoral thesis is titled Glottopolitics, I hope I pronounced that right, Glottopolitics of Inequality, Ideologies of Mapudungun, and Spanish in Chile. His current area of research focuses on a critical sociolinguistic approach to Chile's languages from a glottopolitical, complexity-engaged perspective. Okay, it sounds very complex, Gabriel, and I just ask you, whenever you remember that we have students here, they would appreciate if you could break down some of those complex items in more digestible bits.
Thank you, Wesley.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I am basically a sociolinguist, which means to analyze society and languages, right? And that's one of the areas of work. Actually, my PhD was basically about that. The program is about cultural studies, but there's an important school developed by Professor Del Valle, Jose Del Valle. Many of you, or some of you, might be familiar with his glottopolitics approach, which is basically a vision that thinks of the connection between language as and politics from a perspective that sees those that area in common as intrinsically complex. Okay, well, that's. But I'm also a translator. I also teach Spanish. I have taught English. Well, I participated in dictionaries with the Spanish Language Academy too. I've done many things. But for the purpose of this of this presentation, we will focus on the sociological aspect of the analysis that I've done for my dissertation and my current projects that have to do on how, in the context of Chile, we imagine languages, we talk about them, and we start to redefine what is the meaning of race, of nation, of indigenousness in this particular cultural context. I think, is that a little bit clearer? Wesley, do you think?
Come again?
Do you think that's a little bit clearer? So
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
good. Okay.
Definitely.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. So I will share screen with you. If you give me a second. Okay, let's go. And we'll see. Okay, let's start here on page 1. Okay. So this presentation is called Representations of Mapudungun in Chile. We will talk about debates on race, indigenousness, nation, and language. And let's think about this. This presentation is not specifically about the Mapuche people. It's about how Mapuches and Chileans start to develop new ideas and new negotiations about what is our race, what is our indigenous, what is the indigenousness and the otherness, what is a nation, and how language is embedded in those problems, right? How language and languages are embedded in those problems. Before I go on, I would like to ask if any of you is an expert about Native American cultures or languages, or if any of you is Native American or indigenous, or defines himself or herself under those terms. I would love to hear from you. Or if any of you maybe has focused your research on indigenous identity or languages or cultures. No?
I wouldn't say I've focused on it. I'm just interested in it. I'm an applied linguist and critical ethnographer. So yeah, we're speaking the same academic languages, but yeah.
Good. So what is your field of research?
Academic writing for publication, global knowledge production.
Global. Oh, okay. Yeah. So have you worked with specific languages in some contexts?
I've conducted a study that's gone on for about 20 years of scholars in wow. Spain and Portugal and Slovakia and Hungary. But I speak Spanish. I was in Chile for a few months as a Fulbright scholar.
Wow.
But we are located in a very rich indigenous area, as you may know, and there's we're part of located on land that was Seneca land, where the Haudenosaunee people are here. In fact, there's a book being read supposedly by everybody in Rochester this year by a scholar, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who's indigenous. She's coming to talk here next month. So I think, I'm sure I'm not the only one here who's interested in indigenous language and knowledge systems.
Yeah, I'm sure about that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I prefer to be more dialogical in my approach, because I don't feel like I'm talking. I don't like to feel like I'm talking and dominate everyone via my speech. I prefer to be dialogical. So if thank you for answering. Thank you so much. Okay, so a glottopolitical approach to Mapudungun. Okay, race, indigenous, and nation in the Chilean context. A glottopolitical approach encompasses a vision of language as political. Okay, it's a perspective that is characterized in that it promotes an observation of actions related to language, not only by institutional apparatuses, but also in the various discourses that constitute subjectivity or identity. That is, we think of the political in a multi-layered, complex way, right? It's not only about the governments or the activists. The political is also in every one of us and the little actions we perform with others, right? That's the glottopolitical approach, right? Okay, Chile. Many of you probably have some idea about Chile. Many of you maybe don't. Chile, you know, is a Latin American country. In the context of Latin America, is one of the countries with a highest standard of living. However, it cannot be considered a fully developed country, and it's been under a lot of tensions lately. The focus of my research is the decade between 2010 and 2019, a moment where in Chile there was a massive change of how the society started to see itself and think about itself. Particularly, our country can be defined now as in a multicultural, in a way that cannot be argued. Why do I say that? Because typically the Chileans imagined themselves, or basically the Chilean elite promoted a vision that made Chileans imagine themselves as a mostly European country or Westernized nation, even though our genetic background is not. Our background is basically a mixture of Spanish and indigenous peoples, right? Virtually almost all Chilean population, you know, recent genetic studies have demonstrated I'm sorry, did I say it correctly? Yeah, recent genetic studies have demonstrated that most of us have a massive percentage of indigenous background. You know, those studies can be, sometimes we might think about them with a pinch of salt. Most you probably know that, right? But it's important that now there are genetic data that also confirm something that we already knew, that Chileans are basically mixed race people, right? Okay, that's one thing. The Chileans normally tended to think of themselves as a very Westernized country, very white country, right? Even though the reality of our culture and our bodies does not match that idea. And today we have also the fact that we have to think also about the fact that there is a massive community of foreigners in Chile. As of, for example, the neighborhood where I was living most of my adult life now is 60% foreign. And it's something that happened almost overnight. So the fact that diversity is a reality for Chileans in their everyday life, is something that is undeniable right now. Okay, here we have a brief introduction. According to The Economist, for example, here we see this article of The Economist that says, you know, the British magazine, that says Chile gives immigrants a very welcome, right? Interestingly, many of these immigrants are Haitian, which means that they are Black, in a society where Blackness was always seen as something rare, exotic, even absent. Well, that's a very interesting topic, but we don't have time for that today. Now we're going to talk about, first of all, how this idea of diversity is conflicted with how we Chileans think of ourselves and how indigeneity is presented in the national mainstream discourse in a way that is perpetuated by public discourse, for example, on social media, right? We will Okay. First of all, okay, this is a, there are way too many things to say about Chile. But okay, you have an idea already. It's basically a mestizo, right? A mixed race country that tends to imagine itself as white or westernized. It's a country that is somehow different from its neighbors, right? Peru, a country that is mostly indigenous, right? With very separated racial groups. And Argentina, a country that thinks of itself as mostly white and mostly European. And the narrative that Argentinians construct about themselves is basically all about, oh, how my grandparents came from Italy and Poland and Russia, right? And Galicia and etc., right? So we Chileans tend to have a national narrative that separates us from our neighbors because we think of ourselves as homogeneous, as a country that's racially, culturally, ethnically a single entity. But under the current circumstances, that is something that we have to admit it is not true. It's never been true. But now the elites and the public, the general public, must admit it, right? Must recognize that our intimate constitution is diverse. Okay, so okay. Are there any questions about this so far? About, I think I've been moving really quick, but maybe there's some doubt. Any questions so far? No? Any comment? Okay, let's move on. So, Mapudungun. Mapudungun is the language of the Mapuche people, which is about 10% of Chile's population. It's the indigenous language with most speakers in Chile so far. I'm saying so far because now there are other groups that are emerging and redefining what is an indigenous language. Well, that's a long story. But as of 2016, there were about 180,000 speakers, which is about 1% of the Chilean population. These numbers have been shrinking, and they are still shrinking. Now, the current situation of Mapudungun in Chile can be characterized by the following elements. The Mapuche population is mostly urban and low income. Mapuche people often establish atomized, scattered communities, right? Often in contact with people who are not Mapuche. This is also quite interesting too, because Mapuche population is not rural. Right? People in the Western imaginary tend to think of indigenous peoples, especially in Latin America, as rural communities. But in Chile, the Mapuche, as most people, as the vast majority of Chilean population, are mostly urban, and many of them have live lives that are not different from the rest of the Chilean population. They do not follow specific traditions that are being transmitted generation by generation in small communities in rural areas, right? They are often subject to the same educational system, the same economic system of the rest of the people. And it's been like that for more than a century. That explains why the language is spoken by so few. Mapuche people have been heavily influenced by the Westernizing educational system, but also by the Catholic Church, by the Chilean mainstream culture, right? To the point that in many ways, it's very hard to distinguish who is Mapuche and who is not. And Mapuche themselves say that and do that. One important disclaimer, I am not Mapuche. I am not Mapuche. And I am Chilean. But that does not mean that I've never had to think of my ethnicity, something that happened for the first time to me in the United States. Interestingly, these questions are now being part of what every Chilean, Mapuche or not Mapuche, with immigrant background, etc., or not, is making to themselves, right? Is making to himself or herself, right? What are we ethnically? What are we culturally, right? So that is something that is part of what all of us question nowadays. That is something that I had to experience when I was much younger and I worked in the United States for the first time. And I was and people asked me, I actually, well, it wasn't people, it was a form. I had to fill a form that said, what is your ethnicity? And I remember it said Hispanic, Mexican, Hispanic Caribbean, and Hispanic other. And I assumed, well, I must be Hispanic other, right? I never had to think of myself under that circumstance, right? Because I was never othered, right? I was never othered in that way. So the Mapuche identity in Chile has been subject to historic circumstances that has made it very fluid and easy to what's the word, ignore by the mainstream population, and very easy to cover or hide whenever it is necessary. Many Mapuche people, because of their need to deal in a westernized society, in a racist society, had to basically cover and hide their own ancestry. And last names were the most obvious element that made would give people the status of Mapuche, right? That is something quite different from the structures of racial organization in the United States, right? Where there's been a historically rooted system that designates who is who, right? Those formal categories are not only legal, they are also part of a systemic institutional way of thinking how people are. And what I want you to, what I would like to discuss later is how that political vocabulary of race and ethnicity is now being imported to Latin America, and how sometimes it can be helpful for indigenous peoples, non-indigenous peoples as well, but to political projects of justice, right? And how sometimes that may not be helpful. I would love to go there later when we discuss. Okay. Mapudungun is not spoken by most Mapuche people, as we said. Mapudungun is not being spoken in public domains because Mapuche people are heavily Chilenized, we could say, right? But interestingly, in spite of all that we have said, Mapuche tend to perceive Mapudungun language as something that defines their indigenous identity, and something that is key for defining what is being a Mapuche person, and what is and constituting a Mapuche community. And something very relevant for what we're going to discuss here, the general Chilean society has a very positive approach to very positive view of the Mapudungun language now, at all levels. Historically, Mapudungun language, which by the way is the only indigenous language that in Chile has a certain demographic weight. There are other indigenous languages, but they're very small. Okay, Mapudungun is the only one that has, we could say, almost nationwide weight, visibility, right? And well, this language was perceived as very ugly, right? As very useless. But today, people are valuing this language as positive, and many people want to learn it and want to claim it as their own. Even people who are not Mapuche. So the further we move in this analysis, we'll see that this becomes more and more complicated, more and more complex, right? Okay, there are official revitalization efforts, and those have not been very successful. There are, I think, the most successful attempts for revitalization, we will mention this now, are the Facebook and other social media platforms, groups that have established their own projects of revitalization, and that have become really popular. Well, this is an explanation of why the language revitalization by the government has not worked. And well, these are, before we move further, I would love to talk about this paradigm of complexity in sociolinguistics. That was where I come from. That is the one that I apply when I analyze these objects. We have to think this, it's actually quite simple in its complexity. It's quite simple. We cannot think of sociolinguistic objects as something that we can minimize or reduce or simplify or describe thoroughly without affecting the veracity, right? The certainty of the analysis itself. We are bounded, right? We are restricted by the very nature of the complexity of this object, right? So when we think of language as something that, of course, varies in time and space and social class, we must also think that it varies politically, right? And it varies, and this is the key element, it varies according to the dynamics of power, right? Power is the key element. And the mechanisms that power has established to perpetuate itself. And to perpetuate dominance of certain groups above others, right? But also by the strategies of the groups that have been historically marginalized or minimized, right? Again, also, these groups that have historically marginalized have found ways to subvert, right? To modify these power dynamics. Communicative events also happen in various scales. We can talk about Mapudungun as a language, something that's very vast, that's spoken by many people, but we have to talk about it from events that happen in the day-to-day communication moment, right? In a moment when we face each other as people. So these discourses about languages refer to languages, big languages, but also refer to specific experiences that all of us have had, right? And that make us, and that are politically relevant in our own histories and in our own perception of what a language is and what we are. Okay, I feel like I'm going really quickly, but this is, as Professor Costa de Moraes says, it's a complicated issue. So, does anyone have a question or a comment about this vision from the complexity paradigm? Let me see. Okay, maybe later, right? Let's move on. Okay. Language ideologies of Mapudungun. Some of you might be familiar with the idea of language ideologies, right? Which is basically representations, ideas that people have about languages or about linguistic phenomena. The idea that, for example, a language is beautiful or is useful or has economic value, right? That's a language ideology. In Chile, language ideologies regarding Mapudungun. Okay, I'm sorry. I had them here and I would like to skip and go there right away. This is something that I found on the corpus that I analyzed. The corpus consisted mostly of Facebook debates, but also some press, some mainstream press, right? I found on the corpus that Mapuche political linguistic mobilization tends to ascribe of contra-hegemonic positions in the Chilean context, right? So people who support the indigenous language were against, right, the mainstream political system, and particularly against the mainstream economic system. So they naturally tended to be connected to a left wing or a very radical left wing, as we could say, right, approach to what is language. That is something that might seem natural. In the United States, it's quite similar, right? People who support indigenous languages normally tend to be from the left, tend to be left wing. And this has to do with on how, right, ideas of what are indigenous rights and what are indigenous languages rights constructed in current democracies, right? Right wing, for some reason, is not aligned to that vision. And that is something that is quite interesting because many Mapuche are right wing and many Mapuche are conservative, right? And many policemen are Mapuche as well. It's an interesting parallel to what happens with the Black communities in the US, where many Black people are policemen too, for example, and many Black people are conservative too, even though they not necessarily align to the right wing, considering the current political landscape in the US, right? I mean, they don't vote for Trump necessarily, right? In Chile, there's a very interesting parallel with that phenomenon that we should not naturalize. We should ask why, considering that so many Mapuche people are conservative, they do not consider the language relevant, right? And they do not mobilize around the language. Number two, the language as a strategic tool for self-affirmation and identity. Okay, that is something that makes sense, right? Because indigenous languages everywhere in the world are typically associated to the idea of authenticity, right? You are an authentic, I don't know, you're an authentic Mapuche person if you speak the Mapuche language, right? And also this idea of authenticity is very common among marginalized communities, because I saw it in New York many times that people in the Bronx where I worked took the way of speech as a source of pride, a source of their identity. So this is not very surprising, but it's also part of what is added to this complex mix. Then, this is very important, language as a mystical or transcendental connection to nature, the cosmovisionism. We found on the corpus that often many people saw the Mapuche language as something that connected them with nature or connected them to a religious, or we could say transcendental, spiritual experience, they often saw language as a tool for connecting themselves to the universe, right? Interestingly, not everyone who speaks the language share that vision. And according to what I found in the corpus, the ones who valued the most the language in its spiritual value and the spiritual aspect were not Mapuche. Mapuche often saw their language as their everyday tool, or simply the language that they spoke with their families, etc. But many students of the language claimed that they started to study Mapudungun because it was a tool for connecting to certain spirituality or wisdom. So there's a very or ancestral wisdom, they said often, right? There's a very tense relationship with this in these two aspects, right? Of what is supposed to be an indigenous language, right? For example, that is a common trope in white approaches and white ideas about what is an indigenous language, right? It's something that is mystical, something that is more connected to nature, more connected to an ancient spirituality, etc. Right? Interestingly, many Mapuche reject that vision, but also some of them embrace it because they live it like that. They feel that their language is something that connects them to a tradition, to a religious tradition. However, there is no consensus at all. There's no consensus at all. There's a constant debate of how normal, that's the word they use, how normal Mapudungun should be. That's a very interesting topic because it makes us analyze what do we think about indigenous languages as people who are not indigenous, right? What are how those ideas are mediated, and also makes us think, what is the idea of a normal language? What is normal after all? Why do they use the word normal? Because this many of the people who want to revitalize the language in Chile studied in Spain. Are many Mapuche intellectuals who work in language revitalization studied in Spain, you know, especially in Barcelona. And you probably know that in Barcelona and also in the Pays Basque, the Euskadi, right, the Basque country, there is a strong tradition formed during the 20th century of language revitalization. And they used, and the word they have used is always normalización. Okay, normalization. Let's make Catalan a normal language in Catalonia, right? A language that can be used in our everyday life, right? A language that we can use with everyone. Interestingly, this vision of let's make our language as normal necessarily is contradictory to thinking of our language as special. And a vision that thinks language as mystical is particularly contradictory to the idea of a language, of a language representation that emphasizes normality. So a language, is it normal or is it transcendental? Is it for everyday use or is it for usage with our communicating with our ancestors, with our ancestral knowledge, with our land, or with our spiritual realm, right? Interestingly, this is something that is particularly present. This debate is very intense when we discuss the case of Mapudungun. Because this idea of the is in the very core of what we should do with the language now, right? Should we teach it as something that gives us a connection to an ancestral tradition, or should we teach it as a language that we should all use, and that should be a second national language of Chile, perhaps, in a way that is perhaps is informed by the case of Maori in New Zealand, right, where the indigenous language became sort of a source of national pride for non-indigenous people too. Okay, and we add to this vision the idea of language as a constitutive element of a Mapuche national project. So this is another layer that makes this even more complicated, because many Mapuche people today think that they should have their own territory, their own laws, their own country, basically, or at least their own autonomous community. And the problem with that vision, from a sociological perspective, is that, sociolinguistic perspective, is that Okay, how we define what is Mapuche language? Well, it should be standardized, first of all, something that hasn't happened. And what are the boundaries of this national project? Of this, what are the boundaries, like physical, material language boundaries of this of this land, right? What are the boundaries? It could be the Mapuche, ancestral Mapuche lands. It could be other territories that are much wider. I might include virtually whole of Chile and most of Argentina, right? So a nationalistic approach from Mapuche people to the language is a very complicated topic, because would entail at certain point to think of the Mapuche people as a nation under a historically, how could we say this? Under a narrative, according to a narrative that is historically consistent. That is, let's think of the Mapuche nation as a people that have a territory, that have a language, and that have political autonomy, right? And this is something that has never been done for any indigenous community in Latin America. So it's very innovative. Oddly enough, it's very unpopular. Mapuche people really don't support this. But many of the people who are who support, who are the leaders of a Mapuche national project, are the ones who pushes the hardest for the revitalization of the language. So the people who are making this websites, these Facebook groups focused on Mapudungun language revitalization are actually Mapuche nationalists, right? And want to standardize the language under their own terms. So we have seen so many different topics, right? Okay, so Mapudungun is a language that has to do with left-wing politics in the Chilean frame. Has to do with Mapuche cultural identity, of course. It has to do with, it's been associated with transcendental or mystical ideas of what, mystical ideas, right? Mapudungun has been considered the key part of a nationalist project. And the final point that we're going to mention here is that Mapudungun is also seen now as an object that is susceptible to planning, organization, and management, right? That is something that, for us, it can be a little bit obvious. How come a language is not susceptible to planning, organization, and management? How come a language cannot be put in dictionaries and taught in schools? How is that possible? That language is not subject to those strategies? Well, most languages in the world are not thought of objects susceptible of planning, organization, and management, right? Most indigenous languages are not subject to planning, organization, and management, right? Each community have different approaches to each indigenous community in the world, right? Has a different approach to how they think of language, right? But the most significant thing here is the idea that a language can be planned, can be organized, is mostly a Western idea strongly attached to nation building, right? It's strongly attached to nation state projects, right? When we think of Spanish as a language that can be organized, put to dictionaries, right? Or we think of English, a language that can be taught. That is connected to nation states and institutionalized traditions about language. So this is basically the key of what I wanted to say today. But before we start talking further, I would like to go to the idea of race and indigenousness, right? Which are a significant part of that can be discussed here, right? How race and indigenous are subject to linguistic constraints in the Chilean context. This is very interesting because this works in a way that is rather different from what American history can inform us, right? Let's see, this is the law. You see it on your screens. This is the Chilean law, who defines who is indigenous for the purposes of the Chilean legal system. This can be useful, for instance, for affirmative action policies or for accessing to indigenous lands, and many other policies that have become increasingly more relevant in the Chilean in the Chilean context. We will see who is indigenous for the Chilean law. Whoever is the children of indigenous people, even the adopted ones. If they're adopted, they're indigenous too. This implies a version of the idea that race is something hereditary, right? You can be white, but if your parents were indigenous, like your adopted parents were indigenous, you are indigenous too, according to Chilean law. B, people who are of indigenous origin who live in Chile, but have, we see here, un apellido indígena, who have an indigenous last name. This is rather fascinating. For the Chilean law, you just have to have a last name that sounds indigenous in order to be considered indigenous. And the problem is that some of these last names do not sound odd enough. So they need to other paperwork to tell the government that they are indigenous, right? But from a sociolinguistic perspective, the interesting point is that last names are words. Last names are subject to the linguistic constraints, right? To the phonology, to a writing system, right? They are subject to language ideologies as well. Well, traditionally in Chile, indigenous languages were considered ugly, which makes a lot of sense considering that anyone who had those last names were discriminated against. In the American context, that can be a little bit unusual, right? Because the great divide of racial divide in the US is black and white, and often black people had similar last names to black people, to white people, right? Often. But as an Hispanic, I can tell you that in the US now, having an odd sounding last name today has a weight, right? It has a significance. It's not the names. There is a politics of names working in the US today now in a way that perhaps we're not working a few decades ago, especially in racial terms. Yeah, right. A person is racialized because of the last names in the United States, right? I'm pretty sure that if I had I can pass as white in the American context often, but I'm pretty sure that if my last name was not Hispanic sounding, the way people would think of me might probably be different. I don't know, but it's interesting how the last name is not innocuous, right? And then the law defines indigenous as those who keep rasgos culturales de alguna etnia indígena, it says here, the people who maintain their culture, an indigenous culture, including life, habits, and religion, forms of life, habits, and religion. Interestingly, for the purpose of this analysis, they don't mention language. And one of the reasons why I think the Chilean law does not include language is that, first of all, most people who are indigenous do not speak their languages anymore, and they have not spoken those languages for generations. Right. That's true. If you ask most of the people I have interviewed who define themselves as Mapuche, have not spoken. They don't speak the language, nor their parents. Probably their grandparents spoke it. Of course, this varies a lot. Also, many of them also do speak the language now, but also many of them learned it recently. Okay, and also another reason why they don't mention language in this law is probably the fact that anyone can learn a language. So I can say, hey, I'm indigenous. Give me the scholarship because, you know, I speak Mapudungun, I can prove it to you, right? Which can happen. Fraud has been quite common in when people wanted to, many people use this law in fraudulent ways. They made up indigenous languages. They made up that indigenous backgrounds, right? Because this law gives some visible advantages. Well, let's say advantages. Let's say visible benefits to some marginalized people, historically marginalized people. Okay, so here we have, before we finish, I would like to show you some of these images of who are the Mapuche people. And these are very true images of people of Mapuche having guillatun. Guillatun is a traditional ceremony where they connect to their spiritual realm through dance. It's also a way of saying thanks to the land. They are Mapuche abuelas, right? Ñañas, and they're called ñañas in Mapudungun. Ñaña actually means sisters. Ellas son, they are, this is a very common image of how the Mapuche people see themselves, but also how they are represented on the media. Of course, when we see this image, we see two things. We see a stereotype that has become commonplace in Chilean media recently, but also we see a real, an actual way of how Mapuche women present themselves in society. So as all the objects we are analyzing, when we see this image, we have to think about it in a layered perspective, in a complicated perspective, right? Okay, so I think we don't have time for more, but I wanted to say, Chaltumay, muchas gracias, thank you. Now we can start with all the dialogue and all the questions. I would love to hear from you.
Well, we had a couple of questions here, comments in the chat, Gabriel.
Okay, let's see.
Michelle Springmore wanted to know, was there a historic period as in El Salvador when it was dangerous to identify or be indigenous? And did people hide their ethnic origins, convert to Catholicism, and or change their names to mask their indigenous?
It's a great question. Yes, this has happened for basically the last 200 years, but it became particularly dramatic after 1883, when the southern territories of the country were taken over by the Chilean state. And unlike El Salvador, where there was a civil war that basically ripped the society apart, right? In Chile, indigenous and in the context of that very crisis, identifying as indigenous became basically something that would put your life in danger. Well, unlike El Salvador, in Chile, this was this ethnicity related discrimination was something that happened in, how can we say it, in a steady but slow. Let's not say there was a single crisis. There was always the need for indigenous people in Chile to hide their identity. They always were forced to do it. In Chile, because of our race mixing, many people may not look indigenous, but even though they define themselves as such, and the opposite, right? That's why people who wanted to hide or needed to hide because of job discrimination or because of school bullying or whatever, their identity, they would do it. They would do it consistently. They would do it all the time for a long period of time. So it was not. You might think, oh, this probably happened more during Pinochet's regime. And I think this is probably something that was so deeply embedded in the national project of Chile that probably happened under other regimes before that in a way that was not less violent. There was always a lot of symbolic violence against indigenous people in Chile. Always, it was consistent. Only recently, in the last, say, 15, 20 years, there is Chilean society is opening itself to the idea that we're actually a multicultural society, and it is okay to be Mapuche. And the Mapuche people exist. When I was a child, I remember people would say they didn't exist anymore, right? It was as simple as that. Oh, Pinochet, I remember, he said, nah, they're not really a thing, right? Okay, another question. Let's see. The politics of names has been working in the US and other Anglophone contexts for centuries. Jewish names, yeah, that's right. Definition of ethnic identity are usually centered on language. Yeah, that's a fascinating point of view. I agree with that. Yeah. So maybe I would like to hear your opinion, Professor Curry.
Yeah. Oh, please call me MJ or
MJ. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think thinking about indigenous languages here, I mean, what's interesting is the Mapuche are 10% of the Chilean population, which is much higher percentage of population than our indigenous peoples, and because of the almost near total genocide that we've had, but also because we were such a big country of so many different nations. So, I mean, the idea here that people would actually learn an indigenous language in order to be considered indigenous is kind of unthinkable. Like, it just doesn't match our reality. So, and the opposite is actually true. Many indigenous people have English names because of intermarrying or other reasons. So I think that's fascinating. I mean, one question I had for you about the law of indigenous identity, though, is what I didn't see on the brief extract you presented, what year that law was passed. You might have said.
That year is from 1998, I think.
Ah, okay.
1998.
Interesting.
But it's under constant revision, and now Chile is we're writing a new constitution here, so that might change quickly. This might change quickly. This is quickly changing. The ideas that people had about indigenous languages and cultures and identities have been changing incredibly fast here. And considering the comparison that we're making between the indigenous identity in the US and Chile, something that naturally comes to mind when you compare American society as Chilean society is the relationship between white America and Black America, right? Because there is a, let's say, demographic parallel, because, you know, Black African Americans are about 12% of the population, I understand. And in Mapuche, Chileans are about 10% of the population. So that could be approximately what you could compare. But, and it's interesting parallel. For example, many of the crimes against Mapuche activists in recent years have triggered waves of protests that are very similar to what you saw in the United States with African-American African-American politics, right? yeah, so there is an interesting parallel, but of course, we should not be too enthusiastic about that. What other things are in common are that the fact that Chile has adopted an economic model that is deeply, which is very similar to the American model of economic model, and well, but there are other similarities too. Anything else you would like to add, MJ? No?
No, I'd like to just hear what other people are thinking.
Yeah.
Group here.
Somebody else has a question? In this,
Terry
about this
Bisson
topic?
wrote in, he said, Isabel Allende wrote Lines of My Soul about the Spanish conquest in Chile. And was it intended to shape all these discussions?
Well, Inés of myself, the Spanish conquest in Chile is basically the source of how we Chileans start to start a narrative about ourselves. Interestingly, it's quite different from other national narratives that emerge in other Latin American countries, right? As we mentioned, Argentinians think of themselves as a country of immigrants, right? Like a white country. We came, that's what they say, right? We came from the other side of the sea in ships. The president just said that like a couple of months ago. And there was a huge mess. It was a big, well, Twitter was really happy about it. But there's this myth in Argentina that they are European, transplanted Europeans. Other countries have other myths that inform how they think of themselves. Mexicans have this deep pride of mestizaje, right? Where they celebrate the race mixing as a base of their identity, of their national pride, right? So there's a deep pride in Mexico about their indigenous and Spanish roots, in a way that, of course, does not that does not entail that there is no racism in Mexico at all. Quite the opposite. It's just it's another way of how to manage racial inequality, right? But there is this narrative, right? And in Chile, we have this narrative that tends to imagine our origins in that seminal moment when the Spaniards came here and conquered these lands and basically raped indigenous women. And there is a deep consciousness that even only now is starting to be spoken about, right? That we are basically the children, the descendants of this original sin, of this original crime, right? And when we think about the origin of our race mixing, if you think about it, it's a tragedy, right? It's a tragedy and it is a crime. But how can we live with that? And that's the question that all post-colonial societies are asking themselves. How can we live with the violence that we have that mark our very origin, right? If we're so it's a fascinating topic, but it's a long discussion. But it's fantastic that you brought it up. Thank you, Terence. If you would like to add something else, Terence, it would be fantastic.
I see Wesley has his hand up. So
oh,
Wesley,
okay.
Wesley, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah. So, Gabriel, I was wondering if in the Chilean society, you are seeing something similar to what we are seeing in Brazil. I'm from Brazil, and when we look at the most recent demographic census, in the past decade, we had some important changes in the number of people who identify themselves as Afro-Brazilian or Pardo, which can be understood as a darker mix. Okay?
Yeah, of course.
So technically, officially, we are now a predominantly Black country based on self-identification. And some researchers, of course, looked at those numbers thinking, okay, are we seeing more, young Afro-Brazilians in comparison to non-Afro-Brazilians? Is it because of demographics itself? And then the conclusion is that it might have been, or it's probably it has to do with the greater visibility of Afro-Brazilian movements. Okay, so it is more people have come to identify themselves as Afro-Brazilians. Okay, so it has a lot to do with these movements. Of course, we're not talking about language in this context. It's purely ethnic self-identification. But this may be a starting point to revitalize the language itself, especially when some of the Mapuche people are resistant to the idea. So the thing of being proud of identifying oneself with that culture. So I was wondering if anything similar has been observed in Chile, if Mapuches or people who were not identified themselves as such are now saying, oh, we are Mapuches too, if this has been observed in the Chilean society.
Yeah, I will. That's a very interesting topic. In Chile, the census, the first censuses did not include racial information, but since 1992, it was only 1992 people started talking about indigenous background, right? And in that first census of 1992, indigenous population were only 3 or 4%. Now, people who are indigenous are about 14%, right? Right. So the proportion, where did that 10% came from? How come 1 million people now identify themselves as indigenous compared to the 90s, right? It's probably connected to two things. One, that the census was not addressing the problem of race and ethnicity very well. I remember the questions in the census were not very good. In 1992, were not very accurate. They would ask, do you identify yourself with one of these groups? And identifying themselves, at least in how it said in Spanish, se siente usted identificado con, right? That can be vague. It could be it does not really mean that. It could be a very loose relationship with that identity, right? So it could be the census that wasn't very good, but it could be also what happened in Brazil, right? What you're suggesting that happened in Brazil, that and many people started to connect with their Mapuche roots, and with them. But I would love to show you before. I'd like to show you this. Let's go here. Do you see the screen? Right. Let's go here. Okay. There is this. There is this. This is an interesting. There was an analysis, a genetic analysis of the Chilean population. And if you see, well, Native American is orange, yellows is European, and African is green, right? And this is basically the genetic admixture in Chile. And this is organized according to the proportion of Native American background. Interestingly, this graphic, of course, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, because all the quantitative approaches to race are always, we have to. It's an interesting reference, though. But if you see this reference, you will see that most Chileans are basically mixed race, right? And many people who claim indigenous background probably are here in the extreme right of the graphic, but they also have European mixture, right? And many people, basically considering that most Chileans have some degree of indigenous background, and probably most of that indigenous background is Mapuche, many people could claim this identity if they wanted to, right? If they seriously want to construct a narrative that could position yourself as an indigenous, you could build a narrative on your genes or on your own personal history, perhaps, right? So in Chile, race, as when we think about it, is constructed under social discourses that are very, how do we say it? Very depending of signaling what is the indigenous as another, right? And the other were always marginalized, were always invisibilized, were always irrelevant. They were always irrelevant. They were always inexistent, if possible, right? And now, under the current political circumstances, this might become, they became something that we cannot stop talking about, something that has defined our political current moment, to the point that today's, as we mentioned, and now in 2021, there's a new constitution being written. And big part of the political debate is about this, about how Mapuche we actually are. What is the role of the Mapuche language and identity in our country, in our territory, how could that be related to other indigenous groups that are even smaller? If we, for example, are we going to make this language or in this culture something that is as relevant as something nationwide? Or what happens to people who are also indigenous, but who are not Mapuche, right? So this is something that today is increasingly relevant. It's something that everyone is talking about, right? Okay, another question.
Well, I'm kind of curious, Gabriel, about my experience is more with the Mayans in Guatemala, particularly around the Rabinal area. And your comments about a couple of things kind of throw me off on my perceptions of indigenous peoples. And I may be wrong, but I know like in the Mayan, a lot of their language is very much centered on cosmic or transcendental type of experiences. They have their own Mayan religion and ceremonies and things like that. Their connectedness with the land and being rural. Where it sounds like the Mapuchean people you say aren't so much rural. They're all like scattered throughout different cities or communities. Do they have that history though before the Spanish came, or were they like the only indigenous group there? And did they have their own religion? Did they have they must have been agricultural based and have that same feeling of the land and nature and gods.
Yeah, of course. There are some communities, indigenous communities, that define themselves as Mapuche, who live traditional lifestyles, but many of them have been Christianized. Many of them are Catholic or Protestant today. So the traditional lifestyle that we could see is sometimes an idealization that we can project. we see, oh, they live in the mountains and they're poor and they speak their language. So, and they have this traditional clothes, right? So at first sight, they have a very traditional lifestyle, and probably they have a very traditional approach to language. And some of them connect language to their religion and their spiritual experience, but many of them don't. For the reasons I just mentioned. Some of them are Catholic, some of them are Protestant. Protestant churches have become, mostly of them Pentecostal, American, from American origin, right? Yeah. They have become very relevant in rural Chilean society, especially in the South, especially in the poorest areas. So Mapuche identity today has to deal with all these complicated issues, right? Because people tend to think indigenousness as something that is rural, something that has attached to a traditional lifestyle, something that indigenous people do not speak the dominant language. They have their own religions and their own traditions and their own modes of life. That idea works for a few communities, but most Mapuche people don't live like that now, right? And interestingly, the ones that are more engaged in language revitalization do not live like that at all. They are students in Chilean universities, they're intellectuals, right? And they have, of course, many of them have personal histories that connect them to those territories. But that's something that they want to recover most of the time. That's something that they want to go back to. And some of them are very, have very secularized lives. Most of them, I would say. We're talking about the intellectuals who are interested in language revitalization and in Mapuche politics as well, political reivindications. What's the word, reivindication? Well, in politics, in Mapuche politics, many of the people who are interested in Mapuche politics are very secularized and very westernized in their culture. So it's a very complicated topic, because you can see that there are many ways of being indigenous, many ways of being Mapuche in Chile today, and the way people renegotiate these positions are very complex. And in this way, I would like to draw a parallel with the African American communities in the United States, right? There are many ways of being Black, right? And some of them are very connected to mainstream culture, and some of them live in more, we could say, isolated territories and isolated, we could say, modes of life, right? Or rural. We think of Black communities in rural Alabama and Mississippi, right? That are engaged to deep to deep histories in those lands, right? And some of them are urban African American communities in Syracuse, New York, and in Rochester, right? And they have another type of history, right? So I think the parallel that will be an interesting parallel too. I would love to hear more from you about what we just discussed here, because I think this is a very interesting topic.
Great, thank you. Terry Bisson, did you have something else that you wanted to add or question on it?
Grania, Marcus, you'd like to say something?
Okay. No, I really just wanted to announce since I had lost the date, I put a posting in the chat about the event I had mentioned before. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Grania?
I just had a question. I'm not too familiar with Chilean history. And so I'm wondering if there was a genocide against indigenous people when the Spanish or whoever other immigrants arrived, such as against the Aztec Nahuatl people or against US indigenous people, for example.
Yes, that's a great question. The problem with the word genocide is that it's a crime. It's a word that we must say, it's a horrible, probably the most heinous crimes of all, right? Perhaps. So we must be careful when we use it. We should not banalize it. Is that a word? We should not make it trivialize it. We should not trivialize it.
Right.
So I am not an expert on that topic. I could not say for sure if the processes that occurred during that period of time were genocides under a, we could say, accurate definition, under a valid definition. What I do know is that historians have considered that many of the processes of conquest by the Republic of Chile, not by the Spaniards, by the Republic of Chile in the 19th century, could be classified as genocide. Many of those processes against indigenous populations should be classified as genocide, right? And this occurred in parallel with the expansionist projects, as, for example, the conquest of the of the American West in the US, and the expansion of the Argentinian state in the Pampas, and the expansion of Russia in the east, to the east, right? The expansion in the 19th century, successful nations were the ones that expanded, right? So Chile expanded, and and in this process of expansionism, many of the policies that were established by the Chilean state can be considered genocidal. That's what I know, but I have to underline, I'm not an expert on that issue. But the conflicts that occurred in the moment of conquest are harder to grasp, especially when we use contemporary vocabulary, right? Genocide refers to a very specific type of crime that in Chile happened several times against indigenous during the Republic. In the last 200 years, it's documented, it's happened, right? And we know that in the last 200 years, the Chilean state was responsible for genocide. We know that. In the case of the Tierra del Fuego, in the southernmost end of the country, the indigenous peoples of that area were basically massacred by the Chilean government, and was supported by the Chilean government, but mostly by private landowners. They would pay anyone a few dollars for the ears or the heads of an indigenous person. So that is genocide. And that happened. But interestingly, this happened. This is documented under the Republic. In colonial times, when the Spaniards conquered, we don't have that. We don't know if we can use that vocabulary. We don't know if we can talk about that, because is genocide a crime that can be understood only under modern terms, or is something that we can think of in other stages of human history? That is basically my question.
Interesting.
If we frame it in the context of nation states and institutional apparatuses of nation states, yeah, there's no room for debate. But when we think about it of the process of the conquest of the Americas, something that happened in the 16th century, probably the conditions that occurred there first, and our access to what actually happened are very, there are more questions than answers there, right? For example, the people from the Mexican plateau had the habit of massacring, of killing each other by the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. Would that constitute genocide? That is an interesting question, because that's not a modern society, it's not a Western society. Could we apply, right, this vocabulary? Can we apply this framing of a crime to that specifically historic context? That is up for debate, and I think I would like to underline that, right? And genocide is probably the most heinous crime, that we should take this debate very seriously.
I appreciate your delineating the differences between those things. And then there were millions of deaths because of disease. So that's a different. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question before we sign off. Does anybody else have any questions to ask for Dr. Gabriel Alvarado? Let's see, we just got a note in the chat from Jeff.
Oh, okay.
Let's see, what does he say? Mapuche people have been wronged by their government over and over again. Although there have been attempts to fight back in small ways, that slowly escalated to more violent methods. The Chilean government continues to support corporations and the money it brings to the country over the people who actually live there. Logging is one of the main industries in Chile that is completely export-based. These kinds of industries leave much of the country poor and the environment even worse off. However, this fight is not just an environmental one. It is a civil rights violation as well.
Yeah, this is a great piece of information, because this is all true. I this is all true. It's one of the most significant struggles today for the Mapuche people, right? However, we must not reduce the Mapuche struggles to this specific conflict that is occurring, right? And it's easy to think that, oh, the Mapuche struggles is something that's happening in their territory and is connected to international dynamics of economic dynamics. It is true, but many Mapuche people live in cities and have to deal with racism every day, right? That's part of a broader notion of Mapuche conflict as well, right? Many people who are Mapuche have to deal with poverty and discrimination in, I don't know, in many other areas, right? Not so. Even though this is all true and this is all very relevant, when we think about the Mapuche conflict in Chile today, we often tend to go to the most obvious, which is this, right? And we lose, and we tend to forget sometimes that these struggles are multidimensional and they're happening in many areas of life and in many scales. But thank you. This piece of information is really relevant.
Well, this has been a very, very interesting program and very enlightening and gives us a lot to think about, Gabriel. So we thank you for being here with us tonight and for bringing us up to date and what's going on there in Chile. Wesley, we thank you for getting us acquainted with Gabriel and bringing him to us tonight. And I want to thank everybody who joined us and I encourage you to join us again. Typically, we meet on the first Wednesday of each month. If you want to send me your email, I will be sure to get you on our mailing list. My email is rtward73@outlook.com. Or just go on our website and send me an email through our website. That comes to me as well. So ROCLA.org is the website where you can see past programs and you can see our newsletter. Granny is our editor. She'll be coming out with the fall and winter newsletter shortly. I hope in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think, is a schedule. So be on the lookout for that. It's actually, in my opinion, an award-winning newsletter. Covers a lot of topics, and she does it very well with our webmaster, and we're very proud of it. So feel free to check us out. And Gabriel, again, our utmost thanks and gratitude to you. And we hope to talk to you again. It was very interesting.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I really enjoyed this conversation with all of you. Thank you.